The moment he spoke, it felt like someone had poured ice into my chest. 1 week before my grandson's 18th birthday, he leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said the words that would haunt me forever. The best birthday gift would be if you were gone, so we could finally split the money. The dining room, once warm with sunlight streaming through the windows, fell silent. My hands froze mid-reach for the napkin. The chocolate chip muffins I had baked that morning, lined up neatly on the table, seemed to mock me. He didn't even glance at them. Not a flicker of gratitude, just a smirk that sliced through the air. In that instant, the world I had built with my own hands, the house, the memories, the trust, crumbled in a single sentence. I remembered everything. Every sleepless night spent sewing costumes for school plays. Every paycheck stretched thin to cover tuition, groceries, and unforeseen emergencies. Every hospital visit where I held my children's hands, whispering prayers that I hoped no one would forget. I had raised them with love. I had given them everything, not just material things, but lessons, guidance in my heart, and yet, here he was, measuring me not by the love I gave, but by the money he could inherit. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I had learned long ago that anger was wasted on people who only measured the world through entitlement. But inside, a storm raged. That night, I wandered through the hallways of my home. Each photograph on the wall told a story, smiling faces frozen in moments of joy. But I knew the truth behind those smiles. Many of them were masks. Many of them were calculated, rehearsed, and hollow. I stopped by the living room window and stared out at the garden I had planted decades ago. Roses bloomed as if mocking me, their petals vibrant and oblivious. I had nurtured life all around me. Yet inside my family, greed had taken root. I thought about the moments they had relied on me blindly, the college tuition checks, the first cars, the late-night consolations. They hadn't seen the effort, the sacrifice, or the love. They only saw the outcome. 2 days later, I hosted dinner as if nothing had happened. The table was laid carefully, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, a small chocolate cake for him. I smiled, fully aware that they would mistake my composure for weakness. Conversation was shallow. They talked about school, friends, and weekend plans. My grandson made another comment about the family fortune, laughing as if he already owned it. My children chuckled nervously, not noticing the weight behind my gaze. I served every dish slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite as if it were a rehearsal. I listened to their voices, their laughter, their casual entitlement. They thought I was oblivious, gentle and fragile. I was none of those things. After dinner, I retreated to my study. The fire in the fireplace was low, casting long shadows over shelves of books, photographs, and certificates. I opened my old safe, the one I never showed them. Inside were decades of careful planning, updated wills, trust agreements, corporate documents. Everything was ready, every loophole accounted for, every expectation anticipated. I stared at the names, my grandsons, my daughters, my sons. I realized that the power had always been in my hands. I could choose who would inherit, who would receive, and who would leave empty-handed. The thought was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt fully alive, fully in control, and utterly untouchable. Memories flooded me like a tide I had long suppressed. The time my son tried to convince me to invest in a guaranteed business scheme that vanished overnight. The time my daughter borrowed money without repayment, promising to return it soon, only to treat it as a gift. The nights I held my grandchildren close during thunderstorms, wiping away tears, never imagining they would one day plan my absence like a gift. I had given everything, and yet, for them, love was just a currency to manipulate, a transaction in a ledger of entitlement. I did not cry that night. I did not scream. I made a vow, quietly, in the darkness of my study. I will no longer allow my life to be measured by their impatience or greed. My choices will define my legacy, not theirs. I planned, I calculated. I imagined the moment when they would realize that nothing, no inheritance, no property, no money, was theirs unless I decided it was. Sleep came fitfully. Every shadow seemed heavier, every sound in the house louder. I knew I was entering a new phase of life, one where I would no longer be the woman they thought I was. A storm was waiting to break, and I was ready. The morning after dinner, I woke early, long before anyone else stirred in the house. The sunlight spilling through the blinds seemed almost too bright, too intrusive, as if it were exposing the truth I had already begun to face. I brewed my coffee slowly, savoring the bitter warmth, and watched the steam curl upward like smoke from a fire that had long been smoldering inside me. I thought about the safe in my study, the one filled with documents no one had ever glanced at, the one that held my power over them all. Each file, each envelope, each signed page represented decades of sacrifice, sweat, and strategy. I had learned early in life that love alone was never enough. The world respected power, and my family had only ever seen me as powerless, gentle, and old. I dressed quietly in clothes I knew no one would notice. A navy blue sweater and black slacks. Simple, unassuming. I carried a leather-bound notebook with me, one where I had scribbled plans, observations, and calculations for years. In it were notes on every family member, their habits, desires, weaknesses, and most importantly, their greed. I flipped through the pages, rereading passages about my grandson, the smirk, the casual cruelty, the entitlement. It hurt, yes, but it also steeled me. I spent hours in that study, going over every detail, thinking about what the next week would bring. I considered their reactions, predicted their complaints, imagined the fury on their faces when they realized how wrong they had been. The more I imagined it, the more certain I became. They needed a lesson, and I intended to teach it without cruelty, only clarity. By late morning, the house was alive with the usual sounds of movement. My children discussing weekend errands, my grandson playing a game on his phone, but I moved like a shadow. Unnoticed, invisible, they thought I was passive. Harmless, their old grandmother who could be joked about and ignored. They didn't know that patience had been my weapon all along. I pulled out my laptop and began drafting letters. Not letters of anger or accusation, but letters of explanation. Each one was precise, controlled, and cutting without showing malice. To my daughter, I wrote about every misstep I had covered, every lie I had overlooked, every chance I had given her that she had wasted. To my son, I reminded him of the business investments I had funded and the promises he had broken. To my grandson, I wrote nothing personal, only a cold observation that love had its limits, and entitlement was one of them. By the time I finished the letters, the sun had moved across the sky, and the house was quieter. I stacked the envelopes neatly on my desk and closed the blinds, isolating myself in a cocoon of thought and planning. I didn't want to act hastily. Every move needed to be deliberate. Every detail mattered. I had learned that in families like mine, impulsiveness was punished. The first step was the legal framework. I called my lawyer, a man who had known me longer than my own children had, someone I trusted implicitly. I gave him precise instructions: update the wills, dissolve any pending trusts in their favor, freeze accounts, transfer corporate ownership. He asked for confirmation several times, wary but I was unwavering. Do exactly as I say. I told him, no questions, no hesitation, this is final. After hanging up, I sat back and allowed myself a small, private smile. They would think I was oblivious, perhaps even confused, but in truth, I had never been clearer. For years, I had let them take what they wanted, assuming they would understand gratitude. They hadn't. Now, they would understand the cost of entitlement. The next day, I walked through the house again, touching items that had once been symbols of my care and attention. Photographs on the walls, trinkets on shelves, the books stacked in the library, they had all been silent witnesses to my labor. I wondered if they had ever noticed. Probably not. Their eyes were always on the outcome, the money, the houses, the cars. I had nurtured their lives as if they were fragile plants, and they had grown into weeds, choking every trace of respect for their source. I knew I needed to act carefully. One wrong move, and they would suspect immediately. I arranged the house so that nothing seemed out of place. I prepared meals, responded to casual questions, and laughed when my grandson made another careless remark about the family fortune. All the while I was calculating, observing, predicting. In the late afternoon, I returned to the study, opened the safe, and reviewed the documents once more. Every account, every trust, every clause had been prepared for this moment. The power had always been mine. I had only waited for the right time to exercise it. I imagined their faces when the paperwork was finalized, when the illusion of inheritance vanished, and the reality became clear. Nothing would happen on their terms. I paused, thinking about my grandson. He had been so casual, so assured, in his declaration that my death would be the best gift. I wanted to leave him a reminder, not of malice, but of reality. I began drafting a single, concise note to be left on his desk after everything was set. It would be simple, almost poetic in its precision, a sentence that would linger far longer than any lecture or confrontation could. The night came, and the house settled into silence. I lay in bed, thinking through every possible scenario. replaying conversations and gestures in my mind. I imagined my daughter discovering her bank statements empty, my son realizing he had no control over the company shares, my grandson seeing that his assumptions had been shattered. The thought brought a strange mixture of satisfaction and relief. I was no longer trapped by their expectations. I was free. Sleep came in short bursts. I dreamt of confrontations that never happened, of voices raised in anger, of the faces of those I had loved staring back at me in disbelief. I woke each time with renewed clarity. Every action I would take had to be precise, deliberate, and inevitable. Over the next few days, I carried out minor tasks as usual, keeping appearances perfect. I observed, I noted, I prepared. They remained blissfully unaware that their world was about to shift, that the security they assumed they had was a fragile illusion. Every laugh, every casual remark, every smile they offered was a reminder of how blind they had been. By the time the weekend arrived, I had completed the letters, arranged for legal actions to be executed simultaneously, and drafted the note for my grandson. I had become a silent force within my own home, unnoticed, underestimated, and unchallenged. And yet, despite the meticulous planning, I could feel the tension building inside me, a mix of anticipation and fear. Not fear of them, but fear of the consequences of choice. The weight of finally taking control over a lifetime of devotion and betrayal. I knew there would be no turning back once the first step was taken. When I finally closed the study door for the night, I allowed myself a moment of calm. I had made my decision, and the path was clear. For the first time in decades, I was no longer bound by expectation or guilt. The family that had measured me in dollars would soon learn that they had underestimated the woman who had built their world. And in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, I whispered to myself a promise that would guide every action yet to come: they will not control me. Not now, not ever. The day began like any other, but I moved through the house with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every action 100 times. I poured coffee, set out breakfast, and greeted my children with a soft smile that hid everything I was planning. They believed I was oblivious, distracted by age or fatigue. They could not have been more wrong. After breakfast, I retreated to my study. The lawyer had sent confirmations of the first steps, wills updated, trusts frozen, accounts redirected. Everything was in motion. I traced each file carefully, ensuring that no detail had been overlooked. I could feel the first stirrings of what was to come, a tension in the air that even my careful composure could not fully mask. Outside, the sun reflected off the windows of our suburban street. I could see neighbors going about their mundane lives, unaware of the storm quietly assembling behind the walls of our house. I poured another cup of coffee, sat down, and began drafting emails to myself with notes about timing and procedures. Each word, each sentence was deliberate, every step calculated to ensure maximum clarity when the family finally realized the truth. By mid-morning, the first signs appeared. My daughter called from the kitchen, asking why her checking account balance seemed off. I feigned ignorance, suggested she check again later. I could hear her voice trembling slightly. That was the first hint that the wheels were beginning to turn. My son walked into the study, casually asking about paperwork he assumed was routine. I offered neutral responses, careful not to give anything away. In his tone, I caught the faintest edge of unease, the slightest doubt creeping into a mind that had always assumed control. All the while, my grandson wandered around the house, playing with his phone, making jokes about the family fortune as if it were still untouchable. I watched him from the doorway, my heart calm, my mind sharp. Every gesture he made, every smirk, every careless laugh was catalogued. He believed I had not noticed the cruelty in his words, the entitlement in his tone. By afternoon, the lawyer called again with confirmations. The legal actions were progressing faster than anticipated. The corporate shares had been transferred, the accounts frozen, and the properties placed in neutral trusts. I took my time reviewing each document, ensuring that the sequence of events would maximize clarity when the family discovered the reality. The first confrontation came in the form of a text message from my daughter. "Mom, why can't I access the trust? Is there a mistake?" I smiled quietly to myself. She had assumed control, assumed access, and assumed entitlement. That assumption would be shattered soon enough. I went about my afternoon with careful attention to appearances. I folded laundry, watered plants, responded to casual questions with patience and warmth. They believed I was the same grandmother they had always underestimated. They did not know I had already begun reclaiming control over my life, my assets, and my legacy. By late afternoon, the tension in the house had grown. The casual laughter of breakfast and lunch had disappeared. My children moved more cautiously, spoke in clipped tones, and glanced at me as if measuring my mood. My grandson's smirk had faltered slightly, replaced by the first flickers of uncertainty. He sensed, perhaps subconsciously, that something had shifted. I spent time in my study, drafting a final note for my grandson. Not a lecture, not an accusation, just a single line that would force him to face reality. The best gift is learning too late what you lost. Simple, concise, and potent, it was a mirror of his own words, reflecting them back in a way that would linger far longer than any argument could. The lawyer confirmed that all accounts had been redirected, all ownership transferred, all legal avenues executed as instructed. My children remained unaware, blissfully assuming that nothing had changed. Their panic would come, I knew, but not yet. Timing was everything. Dinner arrived, and I moved through the motions with calm efficiency. The conversation was strained, tentative. My grandson made another casual comment about inheritance, this time less confident than before. My children exchanged uneasy glances. The first signs of realization were creeping in, though they could not yet articulate it. After dinner, I retreated to my study again, reviewing each document, ensuring no errors, no gaps, no chance for correction. Every file, every page, every signature was in place. I thought about the next steps, letters, final notifications, and the note for my grandson. Every move had to be deliberate, precise, unavoidable. Night fell, and with it, the house became quiet. I moved through the hallways, checking locks, reviewing plans, confirming timing. I paused by the family portraits, staring at faces that had once seemed loving and trustworthy. Now they were a reminder of how blind people could be when measuring life through entitlement. I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The process had been methodical, deliberate, and emotionally taxing, but with each confirmation from the lawyer, each silent reaction from my family, I felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in decades, I was acting entirely for myself. Every past compromise, every sacrifice, every betrayal had led to this moment. By the time I went to bed, the weight of the day was heavy, but my mind was clear. I knew the coming days would bring confrontation, confusion, and fury from the family. I welcomed it. They had taken me for granted for too long, and now they would understand, in the only way they could, that life was not theirs to manipulate. And as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I whispered to myself, a quiet promise of control and clarity. They will not see me bend, they will not see me break, and they will not take what I choose to withhold. The morning arrived like a quiet predator, calm on the surface, but brimming with inevitability. I moved through the house with deliberate ease, carrying the aura of normalcy that my family had always taken for granted. Breakfast was ready on time, the coffee brewed to perfection, and the table set with care, as if nothing extraordinary was about to unfold. My children appeared, carrying their usual energy, but there was an undercurrent of tension I could sense, even if they tried to hide it. My grandson, who had once smirked with casual entitlement, glanced around the table nervously, sensing something was shifting, but unable to pinpoint what. Their eyes darted to mine, searching for signs of weakness, for cracks in my calm, but found none. After breakfast, I retreated to my study. The final confirmations from the lawyer had arrived overnight. Every account frozen, every trust dissolved, every corporate document signed, verified, and executed. The transfer of properties, shares, and funds had been completed, leaving my family unaware of the emptiness that awaited them. Their entitlement, their assumptions of control, had been rendered meaningless with precise and irreversible steps. I reviewed each document meticulously, savoring the quiet perfection of execution. There were no mistakes, no loopholes, no chance of reversal. The reality I had carefully crafted was absolute. I imagined the moments of realization, their faces as they encountered locked accounts, inaccessible assets, and ownerships they had taken for granted. By late morning, my daughter approached me cautiously. "Mom, there's something wrong with the accounts," she said, her voice slightly trembling. I nodded, feigning concern, offering soft reassurances. She left the room still confused, unaware that her confusion was the first of many reactions that would confirm the success of my plan. My son entered, pretending to casual inquiry, but his eyes betrayed unease. He glanced at me, then at the paperwork I had left on the desk. Unconsciously measuring it, I offered neutral responses, careful not to reveal anything. While inside, I recorded every nuance of his behavior. The subtle tremor in his voice, the slight tightening of his jaw, the careful choice of words, all of it told me they were beginning to sense the shift, though they could not yet grasp the full scope. I spent hours in the study, reviewing final letters I had drafted to each family member. Not letters of anger, not letters of accusation, simply precise, controlled communications to illuminate the reality they refused to see. Each line was deliberate, meant to puncture assumptions without cruelty. For my grandson, I prepared a single sentence to leave on his desk, a sentence that would encapsulate the truth he had so flippantly disregarded. The best gift is learning too late what you lost. Mid-afternoon brought the first direct confrontation. My daughter returned, this time accompanied by my son, both of them standing at the threshold of the study, their expressions a mixture of confusion and frustration. "Mom," my daughter said, voice rising slightly, "why can't I access the trust? The lawyer said it's been frozen. This doesn't make sense." I looked at them, calm, unflinching. "I've made the decisions I believe are right." I replied softly, "Everything has been executed according to my instructions. You will understand in time." Their eyes widened slightly, a flicker of panic surfacing. "In time? Mom, what are you talking about?" My son asked, his tone losing some of its previously casual authority. They had assumed control, assumed entitlement, and assumed compliance. That assumption was now being dismantled before their very eyes. I didn't rise from my chair. I didn't need to. My presence alone, steady and composed, carried the weight of inevitability. I could see the wheels turning in their minds, the initial calculations giving way to doubt, frustration, and rising fear. Their casual confidence was evaporating. By evening, the tension in the house had escalated. My grandson's smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by a nervous fidget, a subtle recognition that he was no longer in control. His parents hovered over him, their conversations clipped, hesitant, full of speculation and accusation. Yet they had no tools, no information, no leverage. They were trapped within a reality they had refused to anticipate. I spent the evening in quiet observation, occasionally moving through the rooms, as if performing mundane household tasks. I watered plants, folded laundry, and responded to casual inquiries, maintaining the facade of normalcy. But every movement, every gesture, was calculated, observed, and purposeful. Each moment of calm added weight to the storm already taking shape. Later, I returned to the study to finalize the note for my grandson. I wrote the sentence carefully, the ink flowing smoothly across the page. "The best gift is learning too late what you lost." Nothing more, nothing less. It was a mirror of his earlier words, distilled into an immutable truth. After placing the note on his desk, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. I thought about the years spent giving, sacrificing and trusting. Every favor, every hand extended, every lesson taught had been met with expectation, entitlement, and ultimately, betrayal. Yet through it all, I had remained patient, calculating, and observant. The night settled over the house. I moved through the hallways quietly, checking doors, ensuring everything was in order, reviewing plans for the coming days. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but unlike before, it was liberating. I had reclaimed control, and with that control came clarity, peace, and power. By the time I retired to my bedroom, the house was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. My mind replayed the events of the day, each conversation, each gesture, each flicker of realization in their eyes. I had orchestrated the first stage perfectly. The reactions I had anticipated were beginning to manifest. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt a calm certainty. The coming days would bring confrontation, confusion, and perhaps anger from my family, but it would also bring clarity. They would finally understand that life, trust, and legacy were not theirs to take for granted. I whispered quietly to myself, reaffirming the promise that had guided every action. They will not bend me. They will not control me, and they will never measure my worth by their greed again. Sleep came slowly, fragmented by dreams of past sacrifices, faces of loved ones, and the unfolding reality that my family would soon face. In every dream, the balance of power had shifted, and I was the only one fully aware of the transformation. For the first time in decades, I was acting entirely for myself, unbound by expectation, untrapped by entitlement, and fully in command of my life. The day had ended, but the story was only beginning. Tomorrow would bring the next wave, emails, Letters, phone calls, and the escalating realization that nothing would remain as they had assumed. I was ready, and as the quiet night wrapped around the house, I felt a rare, fierce satisfaction. I had waited patiently, planned meticulously, and now, finally, I had the upper hand. Their panic, their confusion, and their eventual understanding were inevitable. I had set the stage perfectly, and the curtain was about to rise. The morning arrived quietly, deceptively calm, as if the house itself held its breath. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, unseen, unnoticed, while the family clung to their usual routines, blissfully unaware that the foundation beneath them had already begun to crumble. My presence was still there, but the warmth, the indulgence, the familiarity, they no longer had access to it. I had left the letters on desks, counters, and chairs the night before. Each one was precise, careful, and unavoidable, not confrontational, not spiteful, but utterly revealing. They laid bare every expectation, every entitlement, every assumption that had guided my family's behavior for decades. My daughter's letter detailed the countless times she had taken my generosity for granted. My son's recounted every misstep and borrowed trust. My grandson's was just one line, stark and unyielding. The best gift is learning too late what you lost. I watched from the kitchen as my daughter picked up her envelope first. Her hands trembled slightly, a subtle tremor that gave away the growing storm within. She opened it carefully, scanning the words with growing disbelief. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in years, I saw panic, not anger, not denial, pure, raw panic. My son soon followed, his casual confidence fading as he read the precise accounting of every assumption he had made. The control he believed he had over the company, over assets, over trust, over me, it was gone. The realization hit him in waves, subtle at first, then undeniable. He dropped into a chair heavily, running a hand through his hair, muttering under his breath. And then my grandson. He had been wandering through the living room, phone in hand, confident, smirking, joking about inheritances as if they were already his. I watched silently as he noticed the envelope on his desk, the one I had left with a single line. He picked it up, curiosity first, then casual amusement, and finally horror. He read the words and froze. The best gift is learning too late what you lost. It hit him like a physical blow. He looked around the room as if expecting someone to tell him it was a joke, a prank, anything but reality. But no one said a word. He turned to my children, seeking confirmation, a hint, a lifeline. There was none. Confusion, disbelief, and finally the first flicker of fear crossed his face. I remained silent, perched in the shadows. Observing, I did not intervene. I did not explain, I only watched. Every flinch, every stammer, every faltering step they took was a confirmation that the plan was working, that the meticulous orchestration of weeks was bearing fruit. The day stretched on, tense and heavy. My children tried calling the lawyer, demanding answers, demanding corrections, all while my grandson attempted to log into accounts that no longer belonged to him. Every attempt was met with frustration, resistance, and finally the undeniable truth. Nothing could be undone. The illusion of entitlement had vanished. I moved through the house with deliberate calm. Meals were prepared, rooms were tidied, chores completed, all while maintaining the serene appearance of normalcy. My family noticed my calm, perhaps mistaking it for ignorance or confusion. But I knew better. This calmness was the quiet before the storm, the anchor in a sea of chaos that I alone had navigated. By evening, tension had escalated to a fever pitch. My daughter confronted me first, her voice trembling but resolute. "Mom, why would you do this? We've done nothing to deserve this." I looked at her, eyes steady, voice measured. "You assumed entitlement over my life and my choices. You are now learning that assumptions carry consequences." Her face paled, and for a moment, she seemed to understand the magnitude of what had transpired. My son approached next, anger in his tone, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. "Mom, this is insane. You can't just..." I cut him off gently. "I can, because it is my life, my legacy, and my decision." Finally, my grandson approached, tentative, hesitant, the confidence he had once worn like armor completely stripped away. He looked at me, searching for the grandmother he had known, the one who had always forgiven, always accommodated, always loved without question. That grandmother was still there, but she was no longer the same woman. Why would you do this?" he whispered, almost to himself. I stepped closer, voice calm but resolute. "Because love has limits, and entitlement has consequences. You will remember this moment, not with anger but with understanding, when you see what you lost." For the first time, he faltered, real fear mixing with disbelief. He sat down heavily, staring at the desk, at the note, at the empty spaces where control had once seemed assured. He realized, finally, that the security he had assumed was an illusion, that the life he thought was guaranteed was now defined entirely by the choices of the person he had dismissed. The house settled into a tense quiet. Even though words had been exchanged, no one moved freely. My children whispered in corners, discussing what could be done, what avenues they might pursue, none of which could reverse the reality. My grandson's eyes darted to me repeatedly, searching for a clue, a sign, anything that might suggest this was temporary. There was none. I retreated to my study, allowing them space to confront the truth. Alone, I reflected on the path that had led to this moment. Every year of patience, every observation, every careful calculation had brought me here. I had acted not out of anger or spite, but out of necessity, to reclaim my life, my dignity, and my power. As night fell, I moved quietly through the house, checking locks, ensuring the letters remained undisturbed. The documents secured, my children were restless, pacing, talking in hushed, urgent tones. My grandson sat in his room, staring at the note, replaying every word I had ever spoken, every lesson ignored, every expectation assumed. I allowed myself a small, private smile. The first phase was complete. They had begun to see the boundaries they had overstepped, the assumptions they had made, and the consequences they had invited. The realization was bitter, yes, but necessary, understanding, I knew would come only through clarity, and that clarity had arrived. Finally, as I settled in my bedroom, I felt the weight of weeks of planning lift slightly. For the first time in decades, I was no longer acting for them. I was acting for myself. Their panic, confusion, and eventual understanding were inevitable. And as sleep began to claim me, I whispered quietly, a promise to myself and a declaration for the future. I am the author of my life. They will no longer write the story for me. The next morning arrived with an almost eerie stillness. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise, a tension that presses against the walls and seeps into the bones. I moved through the rooms with deliberate calm, performing the ordinary tasks of daily life, brewing coffee, setting the table, checking mail. But everything I did carried the weight of inevitability. By mid-morning, the first real signs of panic had become impossible to ignore. My daughter appeared at the study doorway, her hands clenching the letters and papers she had received. Her voice trembled as she demanded explanations, but I only offered calm, measured responses. Everything has been executed according to my instructions. You will understand in time, I said. My son hovered nearby, fidgeting with documents that were suddenly inaccessible, his face a mixture of disbelief and frustration. He tried to call the lawyer to reason, to reverse the transfers, but the calls were politely refused, the legal process already complete and irreversible. The realization struck him with every ring, every rejection, every confirmation email that left him powerless. And then my grandson, he wandered into the study, pretending to be casual, but his eyes betrayed the storm inside. He reached for his phone, attempting to log into accounts he had once assumed were his. Every attempt failed. Every denial of access was a cold, tangible proof that the world had shifted beneath his feet. The smirk that had defined his arrogance was gone, replaced by confusion, frustration, and an emerging fear. I observed all of them quietly, sitting at my desk, a silent witness to their unraveling. I did not speak, did not intervene, for there was no need. They were experiencing, for the first time, the consequences of their assumptions, their entitlement, and their disregard for the one person who had truly built their world. By afternoon, the tension reached a fever pitch. My daughter and son confronted me together, their voices overlapping, urgent and panicked. "Mom, this can't be legal. There has to be some mistake," my daughter exclaimed, desperation cutting through her words. I looked at them steadily, my calm unwavering. "There is no mistake. Everything is legal, final, and exactly as I intended. You assumed entitlement over my life and my choices. Now you are experiencing what comes from such assumptions." The impact of my words hit them slowly, first as confusion, then as anger, then as dawning panic. They realized, painfully and too late, that they had overstepped, underestimated, and misjudged the person they had always taken for granted. My grandson, still holding the note I had left for him, finally approached me, hesitation in every step. His eyes searched mine for the grandmother he remembered, the one who forgave everything, accommodated everything, loved without question. That grandmother was still here, But she was no longer the same woman. Why would you do this? He asked quietly, voice breaking. I stepped closer, voice calm but firm. Because love has limits, and entitlement has consequences. You will remember this moment, not with anger, but with understanding. The lesson is not cruel, it is inevitable. He sank into a chair, unable to argue, unable to move, staring at the note, at the desk, at the reality he had ignored for years. He had assumed control, assumed compliance, and assumed permission. Now, he faced the harsh clarity that control had never been his, that permission had never been given, and that assumptions were never guarantees. The house was tense with a strange, almost sacred silence. My children whispered among themselves, frantic, planning futile strategies, seeking loopholes that did not exist. My grandson sat frozen, replaying every word I had ever spoken, every lesson ignored, every warning dismissed. He understood, finally, that what he had dismissed as a casual remark, the best gift would be if you were gone, was a mirror held up to his own entitlement, reflected back in a reality he could no longer manipulate. By evening, the full impact had taken hold. The accounts remained frozen. The trusts dissolved, the corporate shares transferred. Every attempt at reversal failed. Every assumption they had relied upon collapsed into undeniable fact. My family was panicked, desperate, and utterly powerless. I moved through the house, maintaining calm, performing small household tasks, and observing their reactions. Their fear was not about money. Not entirely, it was about realization. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, and assumed control over my life. That assumption had been shattered, and the weight of that truth pressed heavily upon them. Late at night, I retreated to my study and allowed myself a rare, private reflection. Weeks of planning, observation, and patience had led to this moment. I had acted not from anger, not from malice, but from necessity, reclaiming control, dignity, and autonomy. The legal closure was not punishment, it was clarity. I imagined the next few days, the ripple effect of comprehension that would spread through my family. Conversations would be cautious, arguments futile, attempts at persuasion ineffective. The lesson they had ignored for years would finally be learned through the only language they understood. Undeniable reality. I poured myself a small glass of wine and sat in silence, letting the weight of accomplishment settle in. For the first time in decades, I was no longer acting for anyone but myself. Every decision, every action, every carefully measured step had been executed perfectly. As I prepared for bed, I moved quietly through the rooms one last time, checking locks, documents, and letters. The house was alive with tension, but I remained calm, steady, and unshakable. The family's panic was a silent confirmation of success, their fear a mirror of the clarity I had sought to instill. Lying in bed, I felt the calm of inevitability. I had reclaimed my life, my power, and my legacy. They had learned the limits of entitlement, the consequences of assumption, and the strength of a woman they had never truly understood. And as the night deepened, I whispered quietly, a promise to myself and a declaration for the future. I am the author of my life. They will never measure my worth by their greed again. They will remember this day, and they will understand, too late perhaps, but undeniably. The house had changed overnight. The air felt heavy, thick with tension, as if every corner remembered the events of the previous day. My children moved quietly, their movements cautious, eyes constantly flicking toward me for reassurance, or perhaps for guidance that I would not provide. My grandson lingered in the living room, staring at the note I had left on his desk, replaying my words, the ones that had shattered his sense of certainty. I moved through the house calmly, deliberately performing small, mundane tasks, watering plants, folding laundry, checking the kitchen, smiling softly when my children hesitated in their paths. They looked at me as if I were fragile, old, perhaps confused, but I was none of those things. Every movement was controlled, deliberate, measured, every word I had spoken, every letter left, every legal action executed, had shifted the balance of power entirely. By mid-morning, the panic had grown palpable. My daughter tried to call the lawyer again, her voice trembling as she demanded explanations, pleadings and reversals. Each time, she was reminded that the actions were final, irreversible, and perfectly executed according to the legal framework I had established. Her frustration turned to desperation as she realized that she could not control the outcome. My son hovered nearby, pacing the study, rifling through papers that had suddenly become inaccessible. He glanced at me repeatedly, searching for some sign, some hint, some human vulnerability he could exploit. There was none. His panic was subtle at first, growing with every passing minute into full-blown fear. He had assumed control, assumed compliance, assumed that I would never assert my authority. Now, those assumptions had been obliterated. And my grandson, he had been trying to log into accounts, check balances, call contacts, but every attempt ended in frustration. He sank into the chair, the weight of reality settling on his shoulders like a heavy stone. The casual arrogance he had once worn like armor was gone, replaced by confusion, fear, and the first glimmers of understanding that he had been blind. He looked at me, searching for the grandmother he had once known, the one who forgave everything, accommodated everything, loved without question. That grandmother was still here, but she had changed. I allowed them to struggle, to panic, to realize the consequences of their actions, or rather, inactions. I did not intervene, did not explain, did not comfort. Their assumptions had been shattered, and the clarity they required would come only through observation and reflection. By afternoon, the confrontation had escalated. My daughter burst into my study, voice sharp with panic and frustration. "Mom, why? Why would you do this? Why would you take everything away? You can't just..." I raised a hand gently, cutting her off, my voice calm but unwavering. "Because it is my life, my choice, my legacy. I have acted deliberately, carefully, and with purpose. You assumed entitlement. You are now seeing the consequences." Her eyes filled with disbelief, the anger barely contained, but I remained still, composed and unflinching. She glanced at my son for support, but he was equally silent, defeated in ways words could not capture. My grandson hovered near the doorway, silent, staring, absorbing every detail. Time seemed to stretch, minutes bleeding into hours, as they attempted to comprehend the reality they now faced. The frozen accounts, dissolved trusts, transferred properties, all symbols of their previous assumptions, stood as silent reminders of the lessons they had ignored. I walked through the living room, moving as if nothing had changed, folding a blanket, straightening cushions, responding to cautious questions with calm efficiency. They were trying to reclaim control, to assert authority, but it was gone. The balance had shifted entirely, and they were finally realizing that they had never truly understood me, nor the life I had built around them. Evening arrived, and with it a tense quiet. My children whispered among themselves, strategizing, wondering what could be done, if there was any path to reclaiming the illusion of control. My grandson sat in his room, staring at the note, tracing the words with his finger, replaying every interaction, every word I had spoken over the years that he had dismissed or ignored. The recognition of his own mistakes, his arrogance, and entitlement weighed heavily on him. I observed from the shadows, silent and calm, noting every reaction, every expression. They were beginning to understand. Not fully yet, but enough to feel the gravity of the lesson. I allowed myself a moment of private reflection, thinking about the years spent giving, forgiving, nurturing, and hoping for gratitude. The gratitude had never come, only expectation, assumption, and casual cruelty. And now, they were learning the cost of those assumptions. Night fell, and I moved through the house once more, checking locks, securing documents, ensuring that the letters remained untouched. The notes in place, every action, every detail, had been meticulously calculated to ensure that the lesson would be learned, fully, completely, and inescapably. Finally, I settled in my bedroom, the calm of inevitability surrounding me. The family's panic had peaked, their assumptions dismantled, their understanding slowly dawning. I reflected on the path that had brought me here, the patience, the planning, the careful orchestration of events. It had been exhausting, emotionally taxing, but utterly necessary. I poured a small glass of wine and sat quietly, feeling a sense of release. For the first time in decades, I was no longer acting for anyone but myself. Every decision, every action, every deliberate step had been executed perfectly. Their panic, confusion, and realization were confirmation of the success I had orchestrated. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I whispered quietly to myself, reaffirming the promise that had guided me through the weeks. I am the author of my life. They will never control me, measure me, or take me for granted again. They will remember this day, and they will understand, too late but undeniably. And in the quiet darkness, I felt the rare, fierce satisfaction of finally reclaiming the life, dignity, and authority that had always been mine, patiently waiting for the moment when I could take it fully, without compromise. The house had settled into a tense calm, the kind that comes after storms begin, but before they end. I moved quietly through the rooms, carrying out the ordinary motions of life, preparing meals, checking the mail, tidying the living room, but beneath the surface, everything had changed. My family moved cautiously, their gestures tentative, their words clipped, as if aware that the world they had assumed was theirs had already shifted beyond their grasp. My daughter approached me first in the afternoon, holding a stack of documents with a hesitant grip. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief and dawning understanding. "Mom, we didn't realize," she began, voice faltering. I smiled softly, calm and composed, allowing her the space to process the reality she had ignored for so long. "Understanding comes in its own time," I said gently. "It's never too late to recognize the truth." My son hovered nearby, fidgeting with papers that once symbolized power, now reminders of lessons long overdue. He glanced at me repeatedly, searching for some opening, some vulnerability, some permission to reclaim control, but there was none. Every legal step had been meticulously executed, every document finalized, every trust and account beyond reversal. The realization dawned fully on him. The balance of authority had shifted entirely. And my grandson, he sat in the living room, the single note I had left on his desk still in his hands, tracing the words with trembling fingers. "The best gift is learning too late what you lost," he murmured to himself, each repetition echoing a painful clarity. His smirk, once so confident, had vanished completely, replaced by reflection, fear, and the first genuine understanding of the consequences of his words. He had assumed entitlement, assumed control, and assumed compliance, and now he faced the undeniable truth. Assumptions had limits, and consequences were real. I watched silently, observing every reaction, every subtle movement, every flicker of comprehension that passed across their faces. I did not interrupt, did not offer explanation or consolation. The lesson they had failed to learn over decades would now settle firmly in their consciousness. I allowed them to confront it fully, unassisted, for only then would it be truly understood. By evening, the house had transformed. The casual chatter and laughter that had once defined family life had been replaced by quiet contemplation and subdued interactions. My children whispered to each other, tentative, hesitant, trying to make sense of the irreversible reality. My grandson remained seated, absorbing the weight of the lesson. The echo of his own words mirrored back at him in the form of an undeniable consequence. I moved through the house with calm efficiency, performing small tasks as if nothing had changed, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while the world around me adjusted to the new truth. Each gesture, each word, each smile was deliberate, measured, intentional, a silent reminder that I remained in control of my life and my legacy. As night fell, I returned to my study, reviewing every document, every note, every step I had executed over the past weeks. The meticulous planning, the patient observation, the careful orchestration, all had culminated in this moment. I reflected on the years spent giving, sacrificing, and nurturing, often without recognition or gratitude, and the satisfaction of finally asserting my authority. My dignity and my independence was profound. I poured a small glass of wine and sat quietly, letting the weight of the events settle in. My family had finally grasped the boundaries they had overstepped, the assumptions they had relied upon, and the consequences of entitlement. They had learned at last that life, legacy, and trust were not theirs to take for granted. The house settled into silence, the kind that carries the echo of lessons learned and the quiet acceptance of truth. My children no longer approached with demands or questions. My grandson no longer sought approval or validation. They had been forced to confront reality, and in that confrontation, they had begun to understand the depth of my patience, the precision of my planning, and the strength of my resolve. I moved through the rooms one final time that night, checking locks, ensuring documents were secure, and allowing myself a moment of reflection. The storm had passed, the lessons had been delivered, the consequences had been faced, and for the first time in decades, I felt a sense of peace, clarity, and closure that had long eluded me. As I prepared for bed, I whispered softly to myself, reaffirming the truth that had guided every action. I am the author of my life. They will never control me, measure me, or take me for granted again. They have learned the lesson. I am free. The night enveloped the house in quiet darkness, but the weight of understanding had already settled in the hearts of my family. They would remember this day, not with anger alone, but with the recognition of boundaries, authority, and respect they had long ignored. And as I lay in bed, finally allowing the calm to wash over me, I knew that the chapter had closed, not with malice, but with clarity, dignity, and undeniable strength. The morning light seeped through the blinds softly, painting the room with a golden hue that seemed almost like forgiveness. I moved slowly, savoring each moment, each quiet breath. The house was still different now, heavier with understanding, yet lighter with resolution. I walked past family photos, pausing at each, tracing the faces I had loved, guided and at times, allowed to take me for granted. I sat in my study, the leather chair familiar beneath me. The papers of the past weeks spread neatly across the desk. The letters had been read, the legal documents executed. The reality had set in. My family had finally confronted the consequences of entitlement and assumption. I allowed myself a deep exhale, letting the weight of years of planning, observation, patience, and restraint settle into a quiet satisfaction. I reflected on my life, the sacrifices, the labor, the constant giving that had defined my existence for decades. Often unnoticed, often undervalued. I thought about my children, how much I had done for them, how often my efforts were ignored, how frequently my guidance was dismissed. And I thought about my grandson, whose arrogance and entitlement had once seemed insurmountable. He had assumed, as all of them had, that the world revolved around his desires, his whims, and that my patience was endless. But patience has limits, and when those limits are reached, clarity emerges. I had acted not out of cruelty, but necessity. I had reclaimed my life, my authority, and my dignity. Every legal step, every note, every calculated observation had been executed with precision, ensuring the lesson would be understood, even if the understanding came slowly. I thought about the future. My family would not forget this day. They would replay every word, every gesture, every realization. My daughter would remember the trembling in her hands, the confusion in her eyes. My son would recall the powerless frustration that had replaced his arrogance. And my grandson, the one who had believed my death would be the best gift, would remember, always, the single line I had left for him, the mirror of his own entitlement. The best gift is learning too late what you lost. I allowed myself a small, private smile. The lesson had been delivered, not with anger, but with clarity. I had given them the gift they had never asked for but desperately needed: awareness, humility, and respect for boundaries. The house moved slowly around me, my family whispering, moving cautiously, a new understanding settling over them. They approached me now with a quiet reverence, tentative, careful, not demanding but observing, recognizing, reflecting. The panic had faded, replaced by contemplation, and the first hints of genuine understanding. I walked to the window, looking out over the garden I had tended for decades. Each flower, each tree, each carefully nurtured plant was a testament to patience, care, and persistence. Just as I had cultivated life around me, I had now cultivated understanding in my family. And like the garden, it would grow, slowly, carefully, if tended with attention. As I returned to the study, I paused at the safe, now empty of the documents that had orchestrated the family's understanding. I ran my fingers over its smooth surface, a reminder of the power of planning, patience, and foresight. The control I had reclaimed was mine, absolute and deliberate. No one could take it from me, not my children, not my grandson, not circumstance. I thought about the concept of legacy. True legacy is not measured in wealth or property alone. It is measured in influence, in clarity, in the values passed down, in lessons learned even when they are painful. My legacy had been challenged, my patience tested, my authority ignored, but finally, it had been asserted, preserved, and understood. Even as the evening fell, I felt a profound calm. The family moved through the house now, with quiet deliberation. Not fear, not panic, but a growing recognition of the boundaries they had once ignored. They no longer assumed entitlement. They no longer assumed compliance. For the first time in decades, they saw me, not as the grandmother who forgave everything, but as the woman who had lived fully, observed carefully, and acted decisively. I sat back in my chair, allowing the silence to wash over me. There was no malice in my actions, only clarity, no cruelty, only consequence, and no resentment, only the peace that comes from finally being understood, not through words, but through undeniable reality. I closed my eyes for a moment, reflecting on all that had transpired. The years of patience, the meticulous planning, the careful execution of legal and emotional measures, all had led to this profound moment of closure. My family had faced their assumptions, confronted their entitlement, and begun the process of genuine understanding. I rose and walked through the halls one final time that night, checking the documents, the notes, And the letters, everything was in order. Every lesson delivered, every consequence experienced. The house itself seemed to breathe with quiet acknowledgement, as if recognizing the shift in power. The balance restored, the authority reclaimed. Finally, I returned to my bedroom, the quiet of the night surrounding me like a protective cocoon. I reflected once more on my life, my choices and my actions. I had given, guided, and nurtured for decades. I had been patient when patience was tested, observant when attention was ignored, and decisive when authority was challenged. And now, at last, I was free, not from responsibility, not from care, but from the assumption that my life, my legacy, and my authority could be ignored or dismissed. I lay in bed, letting the calm of finality wash over me, whispering softly to myself, I am the author of my life. My legacy is clear. My family has learned the lesson. I am seen, I am understood, and I am free. And in the silence of that night, I felt a rare, complete peace. The emotional closure, the clarity, and the recognition I had longed for were finally mine. My family would carry the lesson forward, shaped forever by the events that had unfolded, and I at last could rest fully aware that my life, my choices, and my legacy remained intact. The morning dawned soft and quiet, with a light mist drifting through the garden. I moved slowly, savoring the serenity of the house now that the initial storm had passed. The tension in the air was still palpable, but it no longer carried panic or fear. It was a tension born of understanding, respect, and the realization that the dynamics of our family had shifted forever. I walked past the living room where my grandson sat, still holding the note I had given him, tracing the words with his fingertips. His posture was different now, slumped, introspective, no longer confident or careless. His smirk was gone, replaced by reflection and the dawning comprehension that life's lessons could not be avoided. He had assumed entitlement, assumed my complacency, and assumed that his words carried no weight. The note had shattered that illusion, leaving him to face the consequences of his own mindset. My daughter hovered nearby, whispering to my son, who was seated at the dining table with a stack of papers in front of him. They no longer spoke loudly, no longer demanded answers. Their eyes, once brimming with arrogance, now reflected unease, respect, and the slow process of internalizing the truth. They had finally grasped that the foundation they had relied upon, the assumption of my unquestioned compliance, was gone. I moved to the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast, each action deliberate and calm. My children watched me from the doorways, hesitant to interrupt, uncertain how to address me, yet unable to ignore me. The ordinary tasks of daily life had become moments of observation, reflection, and subtle communication. Each gesture carried the weight of authority, the calm of mastery, and the clarity of someone fully in control. By mid-morning, I gathered my family in the living room. I sat quietly, allowing them to settle, knowing that this would be the final stage of our emotional journey together. No lectures, no accusations, no anger, only presence, calm authority and clarity. My grandson approached me tentatively, the note still in his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. Grandma, I didn't realize. I looked at him steadily, my voice calm but firm. Now you do, that is all that matters. Understanding comes through experience, reflection, and acknowledgement. You have been given the opportunity to see the truth. My daughter and son nodded silently. Their eyes reflected recognition and a dawning respect. They understood, finally, that the assumptions they had relied upon for decades were illusions. They had assumed control over my life, my assets and my decisions, but in reality, nothing had ever belonged to them by right. I stood slowly, walking to the window to look out over the garden. The plants, the trees, the flowers, all nurtured with patience and care, were metaphors for life itself. Just as I had tended them, I had tended my family, guiding, giving, and protecting. And just as the garden required boundaries to thrive, so did relationships, respect, acknowledgement, and understanding were essential for life to grow, and boundaries were necessary for clarity and harmony. I turned back to face them, voice soft but unwavering. You have seen what assumptions, entitlement, and disregard can create. You have experienced the consequences. Remember this, not with resentment, but with recognition. Life does not grant control automatically. Respect is earned, boundaries are necessary, and clarity must be maintained. Silence filled the room, each of them reflected, processing not only the legal reality, but the emotional and psychological implications. My grandson's eyes were wide, his earlier arrogance replaced by a newfound respect. My children, too, absorbed the gravity of the lesson, understanding for the first time that their complacency and entitlement had blindfolded them to reality. I moved among them gently, placing a hand on each shoulder in turn, not as a gesture of indulgence, but as acknowledgement of their understanding. I did not lecture, I did not scold. I simply affirmed the truth they had already begun to see. The life they assumed they could control was mine, fully and deliberately, and respect was the foundation of any relationship. By afternoon, the house had shifted into a new rhythm. Conversations were cautious but thoughtful, interactions respectful but genuine. The panic of earlier days had faded, replaced by reflection, humility, and the quiet understanding that lessons, even painful ones, were often the most enduring. I returned to my study to review the legal documents one last time. Each file, each note, each executed plan was in perfect order, a testament to patience, observation, and careful action. The consequences had been delivered, the lessons learned, and the clarity achieved. I allowed myself a rare smile of private satisfaction, knowing that the balance of power, respect, and understanding had been restored. Evening fell, and I moved through the rooms once more, observing my family in their quiet contemplation. My grandson finally approached, standing tall, though still tentative. "Grandma, I understand now," he said softly. His eyes held humility, acknowledgement, and the first hints of genuine respect. I nodded quietly, voice calm and resolute. Understanding is the first step. Respect and recognition follow naturally. Remember this always, not only for me but for life itself. Night settled over the house, wrapping everything in calm darkness. I retired to my bedroom, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. Patience, observation, planning, and decisive action had reclaimed not only my authority and dignity, but also established clarity and understanding within my family. The lessons had been learned, the consequences faced, and the emotional closure achieved. I lay in bed, whispering softly to myself, "I am the author of my life. My family has understood the boundaries, the consequences, and the respect required. My legacy is preserved, my life is my own, and I am free." And as sleep enveloped me, I felt complete, whole, and finally at peace. The storm had passed, the lessons had been learned, and the emotional closure had been realized. My family would carry the truth forward, shaped forever by the clarity, patience, and deliberate actions of a woman who had finally reclaimed her life, her authority, and her dignity.